The agenda this week assessed the viability of home care for dementia patients, considered how to improve history education, spoke to author Marsha Lederman about her memoir as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and sat down with the new U.S. ambassador to Canada. The agenda's week in review begins with Ontario's rollout of $10 a day daycare. We know from the Star's reporting that a coalition of for-profit daycares put pressure on the government to make changes to the program. Was your daycare one of them?
Yes, that's right. And I am on the advisory board of Minister of Education, Steve Flasher. So we have been definitely putting our side of the story and how we were concerned and we are right now. So for profit for us, the operator like us, we had a concern about the bottom line. About our investment, the invested capital in the centers that our franchisees, our partners have put in. And they are almost like $1 million project from a scratch to build it up to the entirely ready for the community. And the other areas that we are concerned, like how they are going to cover under this program the cost of the loan, mortgage interest of the investment, monthly mortgage that payment requires. It is a serious consideration for them in this new funding, how they're going to accommodate these things and how we can remain like financially stable.
Do you think it's unfair?
Sorry, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of for-profits are there to fill the gap that was there before, something that the government failed to do in the past. But do you think it's fair to have, a PR agency and to do this without the involvement of all the players? Shouldn't everybody be at the table to discuss this?
For sure, I totally agree. And they have quite a bit of non-for-profit representation and to represent themselves. But for profit, they have now, as they're inclined, as we heard, like they have extended from September, and it was supposed to be the end date. They had it now November, which is fast approaching. They try to get different parties on board to hear. And as we heard from our Toronto Star Investor Group, that they have come to know that how they have lifted up that cap that they had it initially on the profit margin. And also a lot of the other things they're trying to talk about, and still there are some gray areas that we haven't got the clear answer, but at least they have the representation on the board to, they are hearing their concerns, they're trying to see what the concerns are and where are we coming from and what is, and because definitely the one assurance that we are getting here is they cannot fulfill the community requirement without the fair share or without having for-profit with them partnering in this CWLCC agreement. So definitely they need us to partner there and to provide that big role to properly execute and meet the need of the community here.
Okay, I want to come to Cassidy next because I can hear you. You're having a reaction here. Go ahead.
I just can't believe that we are having a serious conversation about for-profit centers' bottom lines when the majority of childcare providers in Ontario aren't even being included in the program. Like, I really can't believe that we're having a serious conversation here about the financial stability of profit-based businesses while most families who are attending home-based childcare aren't even going to be eligible for this program. That's the real conversation that needs to be had. And to sit here and sort of listen to someone fight for, well, I should be able to pay my private mortgage with public funds, while I'm sitting here caring for families who aren't going to see a dollar of this because on every level of government, home providers are largely ignored.
Because being an unlicensed daycare
has
home provider,
excluded us
you're not even
from
part
the
of the
program.
conversation.
And, we're yelling and screaming, look at us, look at us. Why are we not being included in this? Why is there not being framework built to figure out how to create oversight to disperse the funds? I mean, this is a larger conversation because there obviously does need to be proper oversight to ensure that funds are used appropriately. And
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And so obviously with unlicensed, because there's not a lot of direct oversight at this time, I'm not advocating for funds to be dispersed to individual people like myself. But what I am advocating for is for there to be an overhaul of the current system. Licensing needs to be re-examined. The government needs to stop farming it out. It needs to bring it back under its own wing, and it needs to create framework for the people who are the backbone of the childcare industry to be included.
Dementia, I guess, is an umbrella term which means a lot of different things. So give us your best and simplest definition of what we're talking about here.
Sure. So think of dementia sort of similar to the way we would say cancer. It's an umbrella term for a range of diseases, up to 200 types of diseases that can have memory loss associated with it. Alzheimer's disease is the most common, along with vascular dementia and then a range of others.
And what's the most compelling theory as to why we seem to be seeing so much more of it these days?
An aging population. Age is one of the strongest risk factors related to dementia.
Jennifer Ingram, is dementia easy to diagnose?
Dementia is not, I wouldn't say easy to diagnose, but generally speaking, it becomes very self-evident to the families that we deal with. And if the history is presented to physicians, it can be relatively easily identified. It's more difficult if it gets very complex, if the individual has multiple conditions. And there is a process that we teach everybody to go through to make the diagnosis, whether they are in a primary care setting or in a specialist setting or on a team. It needs to be identified. Unfortunately, it's often not identified in a timely manner, and that's where Linda and I have done a great deal of work.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you. Do you believe there is still some stigma around a diagnosis of dementia?
Oh, there's terrible stigma around the diagnosis of dementia, and most of us working in the field work hard to make people live their lives fully and to avoid feeling the stigma as much as they do. It will take quite a bit of societal change and a great deal of improvement in the care system to allow people to live fully out in the community. And that's really where most of us in the world of dementia care hope to see the healthcare system move, is into the community in a fulsome manner.
Well, let me pick up on that with Linda Lee, because I think we've probably got 6 hospitals within a 15-minute drive of this studio. But I want to know what it's like if you've got dementia and you're living in a rural or remote part of Ontario. What are your chances of getting served under those conditions?
It is challenging. It's challenging for lots of reasons. In primary care, the system of care doesn't support the time and the expertise that primary care family practice has to make an early diagnosis, particularly early on in the stage of conditions when many different things can affect memory and can cause memory symptoms. So getting that timely diagnosis, getting the interprofessional care team that can help with that diagnosis, a physician that's knowledgeable in that area to make the diagnosis, which is the gateway to services and supports in the community that help people to stay at home longer. That's a challenge in some of the more rural and remote areas.
And when you say a challenge, does that mean there are simply parts of this province where you're not going to get served?
Well, that's changing, and some of the work that we've been doing as well has been to try to make a more timely diagnosis to enable primary care to do a lot more so that people can get that timely diagnosis and a plan of care, services and supports in place early on to prevent crises that result in healthcare destabilization and use of hospitals and long-term care transition. There's a lot of work being done right now to help that along.
Gotcha. Charlene Stewart, we've had you on this program many times because you represent the, well, what should we call them? The front lines. You represent the frontline people who are dealing with this issue every day, trying to help people through the difficulties of dementia. Talk to us, if you would, about some of the pressures that the people you represent are facing as they try to do their work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to be back, Steve. We've been having so many conversations about the crisis in healthcare. This is a real important topic, and we need to have more conversations with decision makers at Queen's Park about this. My panelists saying about the early intervention and being able to diagnose, that's what home care providers do. It's the continuity of care to begin with, that when a home care provider is visiting residents at home or clients at home, being able to have that continuity would mean full-time jobs, which we have a human resources crisis right now. But that continuity means that me visiting a home, I get to know the client very well and can quickly identify those changes in personalities, in emotional activities. The early intervention and early diagnosis is so critically important. And because we've got such a critical staffing shortage, home care actually is in my opinion, one of the most essential services, but yet it is one of the most neglected services. We don't pay enough attention to home care, and we have to change that.
The exciting news from Australia is that they've actually identified history as one of the 4 pillars of education. They've had that national conversation, which is what I would love to see us do here. And it wasn't always pretty. The history wars years were complicated, but they've reached a point where they've come to the agreement that history matters, and I think that that's the first step. A diverse and inclusive history matters, and we have to explode the old master narratives and try and piece together something that includes a range of voices and perspectives, and that's not easy. But Australia, along with countries as diverse as Germany, Sweden, Japan, they've all managed to agree on a cumulative elementary, at least, history curriculum, which is something that I think we lack. We teach math year on year from grade 1 to grade 12. Mm-hmm. It seems obvious that we should do the same thing with history as well.
But in Australia, you've got to take it all the way to the end of high school?
I don't know that it's required all the way to the end of high school. It's certainly in the first few years, and they've certainly said we set it as a priority.
Should we do that?
Yes.
We should do that.
Absolutely, 100%. It's something of course, that, changes every few years. It's according to the capricious whims of who's in power and who's in the Ministry of Education and so on. So what was true last year may not be true next year, but I think this is a project that is worth taking on, and it's worth investing that time.
Anthony, there's a lot of cooks in this kitchen. You got the Ministry of Education, you got school boards, you got teachers, you got parents, you got students, and everybody's got a good idea about what ought to or ought not to happen. As you look around, who do you blame? Who do you praise? Who do you blame for because it's this bad? Who do you praise because at least it's as good as it is?
Well, I think the essence is sort of the philosophy, Stephen. I think really there's sort of 4 pieces to the arc of Canadian history. One is that this has been indisputably an absolutely great nation for probably the overwhelming majority of people who were born here or who have come here. The second part of that is that we have failed miserably in our dealings with certain groups, most notably Indigenous, of course, and Black people, other people of color as well. The other things are that demonstrably through our history, human rights issues, equality issues have improved significantly in almost pretty much every field that you look at. The final piece of that, though, is having said that, they're nowhere near where they should be or where we need them to be in coming years. So it's a sort of a sweep of great successes marked by notable failures in certain areas, and that's the way that we have to tackle that now. You can't only focus on failure. You can't only focus on saying, look at us, we're so great.
Okay, Chris Tummet, how about you? Where do you like to point the finger at? If only these folks would pull up their socks, we'd have a better educated populace when it comes to history.
Well, I won't take on the whole question. I would say in my world in the university, I think the dilemma is actually slightly different from what Anthony Wilson-Smith was just saying. I think the dilemma is a kind of over-critical approach, which is tended in its kind of over-criticism to be somewhat parochial. So it's what Roger Scruton, the British philosopher, called a kind of oikophobic approach, by which he meant the opposite of xenophobic. So not a dislike of foreigners, but a dislike of the self, a dislike of our own culture. And I think this is a genuine problem in university history teaching today, in the sense that there's an incredible focus on the sins of Canada in a kind almost in a vacuum. I'm struck by the talking about the need to teach the Atlantic slave trade, which of course we did, and it's a fascinating and fundamentally important topic. But you rarely hear people want to talk about the Islamic slave trade that sent almost even more slaves up Africa into the Middle East. It's an incredibly important topic, really unheard of in North America when we're so focused on just our own stories.
And why do you think we don't teach that aspect of the story?
Well, I would say in the university world, it doesn't criticize Canada, and it's just if you're so focused on present, political / moral goals, then that story does not fit to purpose.
Christina, when you're in the staff lounge and you're not gossiping, I won't say gossip. When you're having a serious intellectual discussion with your colleagues about that damn ministry or that damn school board or those damn parents or those bratty kids or something, who do you look to and say, we'd be doing so much better if not for what group?
I don't know that I would necessarily lay the blame at any one group, but certainly going back to how we started this conversation, we certainly need to start history earlier on in elementary school. I have children in grade 2 and grade 4, that early.
Take us back to your childhood. You ask your mother, why don't I have grandparents? And what's the answer you get back?
It was a very innocent question. I'd just been at my friend's house. She had grandparents. They seemed really great. They gave her lots of love and attention, and I wanted that too. Why didn't I have that? And my mother, I guess, was caught off guard, not expecting this question. And her answer, as I remember it, was maybe a little bit too truthful. She said, I didn't have grandparents because the Germans hated Jews and they killed Jews, and they did that by putting them in gas showers.
You're how old at the time?
5 years old.
Yikes.
And maybe that wasn't exactly her wording, but that was the story I walked away with. And my mind was, of course, swimming with all kinds of questions. Jews? I thought everyone was Jewish, because when you're 5, you think your experience is what everyone's experience is. I was very young. And then, who were these Germans? Why did they hate us? Do they still hate us?
In hindsight, is that a bad answer to give a 5-year-old?
It is a very bad answer.
Just confirming, yeah.
Should I write a parenting book sometime? I will not suggest any brutal honesty like that. But then I was picturing these showers. What did they look like? Did they look like our shower? And did gas come out of the shower head? And if so, how did that kill you? These were all these questions that were going on in my head. And of course, I didn't say a word.
You grew up in what city?
Toronto.
You went to public school?
I did.
Did you get much education in public school about the Holocaust?
0.
0?
I would say between grades kindergarten and 13, I don't believe it came up ever. But my parents sent me to Hebrew school after regular school, 4 to 6 on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sunday mornings. And there we learned about the Holocaust.
At what point did you suggest to your mother, if ever, that the answer she gave 5-year-old Marsha might have been a bit too stark?
I don't think I ever addressed it with my mother, who died in 2006. I don't think I ever recounted that story with her. She probably would have denied it, and good on her. But the lesson that quietly taught me was, be very careful with the questions you ask, because the answers could be extremely damaging. After that, I was very quiet about the Holocaust. My parents talked about the war. They talked about not having food. They talked about some sort of seemingly exciting adventures, or at least that's how it seemed to me as a kid. But then when I was 7 at that Hebrew school, they showed us a documentary, which might have been Night and Fog, but it included these horrific images of corpses being bulldozed into a pit. And I remember looking at those bodies and thinking, one of those people could be my grandmother.
Well, one of those people could have been your mother. Your mother, and I mean, okay, you tell it, I shouldn't tell it, but your mother ended up in Auschwitz.
She did. She was 14 when the war broke out, and she was sent to the ghetto with her family. At 15, she was kidnapped on the street. That was her terminology. I think it's appropriate, by a Nazi soldier who made her set up a barrack for Nazis who were going to be overseeing the ghetto, and then made her move in there the next day. Imagine a 15-year-old daughter, your 15-year-old, letting her be with these Nazis, living in that situation.
The president did say, quote, instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's make it in America. And I put make it in America at the heart of my economic plan. And when people in this country hear that, and of course, we're a big trading country, we wonder whether we should be nervous when we hear these kinds of statements.
So I'm happy to say that Canada has no reason to be nervous. And elected officials and presidents say a lot of things, and they say them at different times in different contexts. The language you were quoting came from the State of the Union address, where the president was trying to make a point about the importance of the integrity of United States supply chains, but most of the reference was dealing with the integrity of those supply chains as a defense mechanism against autocratic countries like China and Russia. Those comments, by the way, were prescient with what has happened with Russia, Ukraine, and Russia trying to hold the world hostage with its energy exports, and that's exactly the kind of behavior that the president was trying to protect against. So I would refer you to almost contemporaneous comments, which were a joint statement made by the president and the prime minister on the one-year anniversary of the roadmap for a renewed partnership between the United States and Canada, which first of all sets out a comprehensive strategic and tactical partnership based on 6 pillars of the United States and Canada working together to advance economic interest. And on that one-year anniversary, in that statement, there is a line in that statement which talks about the importance of the United States and Canada working together to preserve and to grow the integrated supply chains that form the basis of an economic relationship between the United States and Canada.
Ambassador, that's all great. Except, I have to remind you, there are times when this administration has put bills before Congress about Buy American, which requires our people to go down there and start lobbying like crazy to get the Canadian exemption. So we wonder how much you love us, actually.
Well, let's talk about Buy America, Buy American, 2 different concepts, by the way. First of all, it is both of those principles apply to federal procurement only. So they're not protectionist in any way whatsoever. A protectionist approach would limit Canadian business participation in the overall trade and economic relationship with the United States. I'll remind you that that trade relationship is 2.6 billion Canadian dollars a day. It is Canada's largest trade relationship. It is the United States' largest trading relationship. And on top of the national figures, more than 30 states in the United States count Canada as their #1 export partner. That doesn't sound very protectionist to me.
But we occasionally have to remind you of that all the time.
Well, you don't have to remind me
about it. Not you,
but you don't have to remind me about it. So that's number one. Number two, it is simply a common element of national procurement policy to at times favor businesses located in the country spending the money. Canada has Buy Canadian policies in its federal procurement. And as recently as COVID procurement, Canada implicated its Buy Canadian standards to limit purchases of COVID supplies, personal protective equipment to Canadian businesses in an explicit Buy Canadian policy. So these are not tensions. They're the way countries do business. And it's simply, Canada doesn't have to come down to Washington and beg for waivers and carve-ins and things like that. This is all part of an ongoing dialogue which occurs in the context of the legislation, in the context of the relationship.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.